particularly called it where it will it all end, you know, kind of like where does kind of succession go, where does like nature go with its processes over time. And of course we know it never ends, it changes. Like what is the only constant thing is change. um, so um, looking at the two terms succession and polyculture to start with. Succession, uh, I've yes, I've got an image there that is a poster I've drawn years ago, and I don't think I'll ever do it that well again. So I'm just keep reusing that poster, and what you're seeing there from the left to the right is kind of what might be a progression over time from bare grounds to a very simple ecology with few hardy plants to like increasingly rich and diverse ecology where many species jostle for space, both above ground and below ground, and eventually to an ecology where you've got like some species that's kind of are taking up most of the space in the long run, and then kind of leaving niches for other things to grow underneath and in between. And over that long-term process, which can be really decades in the making, um, what is happening is that biomass is enriched, so like the soil below ground as well as the uh, like yeah, biomass above ground is becoming more and more. And as we go through that progression, as the landscape goes through that progression, um, different niches become available that different species are adapted to. So the composition of species will change over time. And that's something we want to keep in mind when we're designing with this concept. So in some ways we can see kind of that succession as an edge over time, edge in time, you know, so that keeps moving. But if you're looking at the picture as I've drawn it, you could also very temporarily, very straightforwardly interpret it as an edge in space. So that's a very typical, like that could be a very typical grassland, woodland edge with a bit of like agricultural feel to the left, you know, and so you see that in many places in the countryside. And so um, what we're looking at there when we see that sort of space in the countryside is kind of we're seeing uh, a snapshot of a succession, because if we're doing that thought experiment, what would happen if we left this space to itself? Then over time, the species from the right would kind of like slowly like creep and march and move towards the left and would occupy that space in our humid temperate climate that we've got in Britain and Western Europe. So of course, in a place like Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, so that might look different because there are different limitations working on that ecology. And so where there's less water, we've already talked about water as a critical limit, where there's less water, the progression will maybe not move all the way to like a dense woodland ecology, you know, so it might be savanna, you know, and um, that is in fact very typical of many like dry arid places, you know, so where if you're thinking of the Serengeti, if you're thinking of like the steppe in Eastern Europe or the prairie in North America, you know, so they're very pampa in South America, so they're very typical grassland ecologies that are limited by the amount of available water. Another thing to say is that that succession is not always linear, so that it can be sometimes it can temporarily be reversed, that it can be deflected by environmental changes and so on. And yeah, so we look at some of those things in more detail. Polyculture is a way of growing things together. So growing things together in designed plant communities. So what you're seeing here is kind of is a community of annual and perennial herbs and some small shrubs in the yard where I live. So it's kind of it can be a very small scale. It can also be huge. So the scale can be scaled. What all those polycultures have in common is that they're using natural ecosystems and the uh, different ways that plants interact, plants and animals and so on interact in ecosystems as a model and like model themselves along them. Um, they often don't look like natural ecosystems. They often look very different from each other. And like the art of designing them really is like to match the plants to the conditions in each particular spot, to light, moisture, soil conditions, and so on. So what we call the abiotic factors. So that's underlie kind of the living world. So just like briefly running through the stages of succession and showing some examples of how we can work with them. So the first stage is a pioneer stage. So that is kind of at the beginning. So in this case, this is a river mouth. So that river, kind of the River Spain, Scotland, kind of like changes course all the time, and these like areas of shingle, just of bare rock washed down from the Grampian Mountains appear. And within a year, basically that bare ground has been colonized by like a really quite a rich diversity of different plants. And what all those plants have in common is that they deal with the limits of that space very well. So they can live with very few nutrients, with no topsoil at all, really, and they can get going. Just a seed will drop, and off it goes. So there are a lot of plants, pioneer plants, that are adapted to those conditions, and what they do is they is that they prepare and enrich the ground for other plants that are more needy, more fragile, kind of more nutrient hungry. We often need more shelter as well. But what these plants also do is they start attracting insects, they start attracting birds, and those insects and birds will again kind of will interact and bring in new seeds, bring in new fertility, and help build that place up. So that's the bare ground pioneer stage, and we can mimic that in kind of what's here is a vegetable polyculture. So that's one in Nepal. In fact, that's a picture that Chris has provided, and yeah. So what when we're growing annuals, vegetables, as annual flowers as well, and so on, they generally depend on bare ground, and so it makes a lot of sense there to mimic that vegetable, like that annual or like a pioneer stage polyculture pattern. And so yeah, we can include some perennials as well, but kind of like using it as an annual space that's kind of is uh, yeah redesigned and like recultivated every year, or replanted every year. That would be one way of like using the pioneer stage as a pattern for a polyculture. Um, so looking at the next phase, so once like that pioneer stage has gone on for long enough, then generally what happens in um, a lot of parts of the world is that grasses will take over. Grasses are an incredibly diverse family of plants, over 2,000 species adapted, and they are adapted to ecologies from the Arctic to the tropics, so they're everywhere. And they're particularly good at kind of colonizing the the top layer of the soil and really forming this dense mat, that is excellent at holding the soil together over time, so as kind of they die off, they build up that soil layer, the topsoil layer, to great depth sometimes, so there are topsoils of like 1 meter in the prairies and more, and so they can be incredibly rich. And what keeps them going, and both what limits them and keeps them going, is the interaction with animals. So grassland, um, like a healthy grassland, is generally a sign that there's animals involved in maintaining that. And those of you who are working with sheep, so that is your they're excellent grassland managers, as we know, and what they're actually doing is very often they nibble out all the plants that want to come in and take over from the grassland, so they're keeping it like on that ground level. There are many wild animals uh, like like savanna animals in Africa. There's like all the there's like historically the buffalo in North America, uh, horses in Central Asia, and so on. If those animals aren't around, but we want grassland, then we're the animal, So in terms of managing these spaces and creating grassland, um, like wildflower meadows are a very traditional management form in our part of the world, in Europe, and they actually create very species-rich wildflower meadows. So they are kind of a very valuable part of the ecology in this part of the world. And so yeah, so like that little inset is just showing kind of how this particular grassland in Devon in the community is managed by mowing, and then the mowings you can of course feed them to animals, can get the animals to feed themselves with it, but you can also use that hay if you get it early enough before the grasses and the wildflowers start to seed. So we're cutting in May every year, and we're using that as compost, so you can uh, like if you let those piles rot down, you can plant directly in them, or you can move them uh, and use the compost somewhere else. Um, Another possibility, an alternative, like to work like with the perennial stage, is kind of using that, like creating those much more artificial perennial polycultures where you've got a lot of uh, herbs, vegetables, flowers, um, that you bring together, and kind of what you're trying to do is like use all the space above ground and below ground. So making sure that the root space is really well covered as well, because if you don't cover that ground above and below, then grasses will come in eventually, or other competitive plants, and they will like dominate that area. So to have a like functioning, rich perennial polyculture, you need to do a bit of um, yeah, playing with the like root and growth patterns above ground. The next stage of succession, moving on from grasslands, that will generally happen in humid areas, is the scrub stage. So this is one of my favorite landscapes and that's in West Yorkshire in Calderdale, above Hepton Bridge, and I've been watching this field for about 20 years. And 20 years ago, there was very little heather. There were a few little saplings of hawthorn, rowan, birch, um, and then this picture was taken about 10 years ago, and so you see how it's really changed into something much more lumpy. So there's area patches of scrub, there's like the heather, there's like a bramble in other areas. There's a lot of young trees, and so uh, they're kind of yes, and that sort of pattern, that lumpy pattern of small trees, shrubs, open areas, that is really the classic niche for a lot of the uh, perennial polycultures that we're traditionally using, and also that we're like newly designing. So if you're thinking about forest gardens, that's exactly where we want to be. So we want fruit trees, we want fruit bushes, perennial vegetables, and so on. So this is a very urban forest garden, about a mile from the center of Manchester. So you can fit these uh, designed ecologies into all sorts of spaces and settings. And in terms of perennials, we've got strawberries there as a ground cover. We've got uh, artichokes and fennel as tall herbs. We've got currants in the bush layer, and then kind of fruit trees above that. And we even got some grass, because you can make clearings and kind of have.
Hello?
Oh,
Yeah. Oh.
You can have clearings for people, because like with all of these ecologies, or all of these spaces, they work best if people are actively engaged. So if you're making a niche for people, in this case the parents and their kids, like as a playground, and a bit of grass with a few seats for the parents. If you make those niches, then the people will come and use those spaces. So that's great. Very mature forest garden in the middle of Manchester, great example. Um, Another classic example there is orchards and soft fruit, of course, and so both fruit bushes and fruit trees. I mean, a lot of the fruit bushes would be naturally occurring in a scrub stage, and also the wild relatives of uh, plants like apple, like pear, like cherry. They're classic pioneer uh, trees. So they are the young trees and like not very long lived, that prepare the ground for like the longer lived trees like oak or beech or um, some other lime, kind of depending on where you are in the world. So those are possibilities for that scrub stage. And I mean that Chris would probably say agroforestry. So agroforestry is an interesting one because very often kind of you space the trees out wider than they would be in natural in a natural setting, and so you're creating design systems that have no direct equivalent in nature, but still using some of the patterns that we find, especially in the grassland and the scrub stage. So that's yeah, I'd fit those into that system as well, and sometimes in the woodland stage. So the woodlands in humid climates is where everything moves towards. So whether that's tropical rainforest, whether that's like broadleafed or coniferous forests, like in temperate climates. And so yeah, so we do go through a succession there with the woody plants as well. So in this case, this is a young woodland with woodland edge with birch trees, with some older trees planted as well, and then like they will eventually give way to a species like oak or chestnut that are very long-lived, cast more shade, um, and take up more space in the long run. So woodlands, um, again, kind of a very rich ecology, and kind of like basically that's where the biomass buildup really like kicks in, like in the trunks of the trees. And there are many traditional ways of managing woodland, like coppice, like continuous cover forestry, where just like individual trees are taken out rather than like clear fell, like modern industrial clear fell. So we can manage like natural woodlands in that productive way in many ways, or we can again use it as a model for creating food forests where kind of we plant specialist shade-loving plants like hosta in this case under the canopy layer, and then can use that as a forage ecology. So, and if we're thinking of humanity of Homo sapiens actually originating in rainforests, in forests and savanna ecosystems, and being a forager. So like originally we all were foragers, hunter gatherers is a different word, and so by creating these forage systems, we can really kind of recreate some of the connections that with other beings, other species that we have lost over the like 10,000 years of agriculture, and so I think it's quite a profoundly different way of interacting with the world than kind of plowing and kind of growing a crop on that, which in some cases is appropriate, but in many cases also really destructive. So, so that is the progression that we are coming through in terms of yeah, in terms of succession towards forest. It doesn't end there. So what we always get is one way or another disturbance. So this is just an example of like a big birch tree, the biggest I've ever seen coming down on our land. And of course, kind of if a big tree falls in a woodland area, suddenly where there was a lot of shade, now there is all this light, and suddenly there are opportunities for species that couldn't have grown there. And either from the seed bank in the soil or from bringing like birds, animals, like mammals, bringing in seeds, kind of some new plants, that light-loving plants might emerge, um, and so can and change the ecology slightly until the space is taken up yet again by kind of the shades, like casting kind of bigger trees. And we can use that pattern of disturbance. We can work with that pattern of disturbance in a conscious way. So this is just a diagram to um, visualize how that might happen in terms of creating forest gardens. So when we create forest gardens from scratch, like from a flat piece of ground, and the first thing we do is we're trying to accelerate succession. So we're trying to get to that kind of juicy kind of sweet spot where woodland meets open ground and kind of is all the scrub layer in between. So we're trying to get to that spot quickly, but then once we've reached that spot, we need to decide, do we let the system just move itself gradually further towards a darker, kind of shadier woodland, because it will if we let go at that point, or do we consciously decide to slow down and partly reverse succession, so like creating conscious disturbance in the area in order to maintain patches of light within that system. So that's a management decision you'll have to take, like when the system has reached a level of maturity you were aiming for. So here's a forest garden by Graham Bell in the borders of Scotland, and you see kind of how there is quite a lot going on in the canopy. So there's like conifers, there's walnuts, and so on. And so him and Nancy they consciously they planted quite a lot of birch and alder, which like helped to create that woodland feeling, that canopy feeling very early on. But then every year they take out at least one tree, and sometimes they leave some of the tree standing as well, and that again that's excellent habitat for all sorts of invertebrates and fungi and then birds eating off those and little creatures. So it's a becomes a really valuable habitat in itself, dead wood. So that's worth leaving as well. And the fact that they're taking out that amount of like shade casting tree like every year means that there's always basically the light levels remain ambient for a lot of the undergrowth underneath that needs some light. Another pattern of regular disturbance is coppicing, which you may have come across. So that coppicing means cutting woody growth off on the ground, and in this case, that's willow coppice, like basketry willow. Basketry willow you want to cut every year to keep it fresh and kind of keep the colors most vibrant. You could also like let one stem grow and then cut it above ground, which then would be pollarding, and that's often done if you have some animals underneath that might otherwise eat the new growth. And in our case, kind of we've got this in a wetlands system, so there's like ponds, they're standing at the edges of ponds, so it's a great way of using that area. Another aspect of disturbance is animal impact. So the fact that animals will also make everything gardens, we've been talking about this, and so a lot of animals will garden in order to create the landscapes they want to live in. So deer are basically kind of very happy to live in like landscapes with a bit of tree cover for shelter and a lot of open ground for forage, and so this is an old parkland in Somerset, and kind of you see these magnificent old chestnuts, and old oak trees and so on in that place. What you don't see a lot is young regrowth, and that is a clear sign that kind of the deer there are masters of the area, so and in a way kind of doing like too much of a good thing for themselves, because ultimately their grazing out of young tree growth will get rid of the old trees eventually, and so some sort of management will be needed in order to like let any woodland regrow in that area. So that's generally kind of a lesson for like animal forage systems. In this case, there's one for ducks and chickens. It's a forest garden in Gloucestershire. And yeah, so if you are integrating animals into your polyculture, then there often you have to find some way of timeshare, so that the animals use that system for some of the time, but then they're also excluded from areas for some of the time so that the vegetation has a chance to recover. So there's like that a pattern of timeshare going on there, the niches in time. And cool. So there's a whole like range of possibilities you've just seen in terms of like using succession and using polycultures in different stages of succession. I've included in the slideshow, which is shared as ever, I've included the whole poster that I drew, and that summarizes a lot of those points that I've just been making. So you can look at that in your own time, in the comfort of your own home, and get a bit more detail on that. And then I've also included another slide which just like gives a not slightly different perspective on polyculture. So overlaying that with the idea of zoning, so like from small scale intensive systems to large scale extensive systems. And so there you see that different types of polycultures exist depending on the setting and the scale that you're working on, and so there are all options to play with. So as I say, that whole slideshow will be available, so you can have a good look at that. Right, so I see quite a lot of interaction in the chat, and there's probably a few questions, which we hopefully will have a bit of time to look at. But before we do that, I suggest we go to a little bit of a breakout room conversation between you and just like having watched this, having seen some of the possibilities of polycultures and like how to work with different stages and different phases of landscape succession. Just have a bit of a chat to see, yeah, kind of how could I use that in my particular situation? How could that be useful for working where I am? And I know some of you only have like a balcony or like a small urban garden, but think about it, kind of what possibilities can you see in terms of using these patterns? So Ruba, could I ask you to um, get the
Yes,
breakout
yes,
rooms going? So
yes.
great. So it's 12:33. So we've got yeah. So we've got 10 minutes for this. So um, take it away. And again, any questions, put them in the chat. Okay, I think we're all back in.
I think you might be
So,
barking up the wrong tree there, Thomas.
oh dear. Right, well, great to have you all back, and I hope, yeah, you had some fruitful conversation there. Um, and um, yeah, just see if there's any questions on that subject. We've got a little bit of time to address anything if somebody has got some specific things they want to ask. Uh, um, if not, that's also cool. We can go to the next thing, which is uh, just looking at one of the examples of polyculture that you could try out. So it's kind of and we've shared it in the home play. So it's this a booklet on mixed vegetable gardening.